Hey Petty fans, welcome to episode 8 of the Richard Petty Motorsports podcast, presented by Petty's Garage.
Presented by Petty's Garage. This week, we have another legend.
Oh yes, we are on location. We're at the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and our guest is Executive Director of the Hall of Fame, Winston Kelly.
Winston Kelly. Awesome stories in this podcast. I just want to jump into it.
Absolutely. When you're listening to this podcast, we just finished up the race in Las Vegas, getting ready to head to Phoenix this week. And if you're not familiar with Winston for some reason, you probably have heard his voice on the MRN broadcast. He's also a very close family friend of the Pettys, and that shines through in this interview. Lifelong Petty fan, so can't thank him enough for his time. Can't thank the Hall of Fame enough for letting us come set up in their space and record this episode, and really excited for you all to hear it. So here's Winston.
Winston Kelly, and that's spelled Kelley, and I grew up in Concord, North Carolina, and I am the executive director here at the NASCAR Hall of Fame.
It's an awesome title to have.
Yeah.
Those who can do, those who don't just have a title.
Well, first and foremost, thanks again for taking time out of your busy day. I know you got a crazy schedule and lots going on right now to chat with two knuckleheads like us, so thank you.
Happy to be here, and when I think about all that the Petty family means to me personally, and all the Petty family means to the industry, if you're associated with the Petty family, you're good people, and you're family as far as I'm concerned.
I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to agree with that too.
Yeah, yeah, and we were talking a lot leading up to this episode, and me and Bradley both were saying, growing up, on a Sunday drive, you put on the radio in the car. You guys were like family. You and your team. I mean, it's etched into my memory. I know. Just as a kid, looking out the window, no tinted windows back then. Sun's pouring in. You're going down the highway and you're listening to you guys call a race, and it means a lot for us to be here. We really appreciate the memories we have, and for being here today. So thank you.
Well, that's how I became a fan. Just listening to races, going to races with my dad, and I think we all are in that same boat.
Talk a little bit about your dad's position and how that kind of inspired you to follow in his footsteps.
Well, Dad was the first public relations director at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, and he did that up until through 1964. And then left and went to work for another organization. Then he and Mom bought an auto parts store in Concord. Well, as PR director for Charlotte, he did a lot of public address announcing work because he had been in and around. He actually drove a little bit, not a whole lot, but he did a lot of PA work. He had been a newspaper man before he went to the Speedway, and just promoted races and had grown up around it himself, or had been around it himself. He didn't grow up around it. So he had done a lot of PA type work, which led to him working for the Universal Racing Network on a part-time basis. So if he went to the race close enough to the Rockinghams, the Martinsvilles, the Atlantas, my brother and I would tag along with him if we could. And the very first race I ever went to, he was still at the Speedway, was the 1964 Daytona 500. He was down there for 2.5-3 weeks or something. Back then they did that. They took my older brother, who's about 19 months older than I am, and I out of school, got our schoolwork and all. So we went down for the week and got to go to the track some. And so we went to the qualifying races, and I'm 6 years old at the time, so I remember enough about it in the week. And as you might know, the King won the race. And I got to meet him after the race, and I can't remember if it was in Victory Lane or up in the press box, but there's actually a picture. We've used it here in the hall, unbeknownst to me, but it's in the Petty Museum, of Richard sitting on the car, and there's a guy holding a microphone. That's Dad.
Oh, wow.
So that is there. And I remember Richard he acknowledged me. And Mom likes to tell the story, and I'm not going to argue with my mom. Mom tells the story that I tugged on his uniform, and I think this was in the press box, that I was tugging on his uniform to get his attention while Dad was talking to him, and he leaned down, and I told him, I was pulling for Fireball till he fell out of the race, then I started pulling for you. And she said it went out over the PA and all that. Now, Mom swears that story's true. And, when you think about it, okay, I'm 6 years old. Fireball had his lavender car and Richard had the petty blue car. So it's probably that attracted me. But the fact that Richard, more than acknowledged me, and he's no different. And I've got a picture on my desk now that he was giving me an autograph. I'm probably about 8 years old, I think, just looking at the picture. A couple of years later, behind probably the station wagon that Miss Linda would take to the track and feed it and have chicken and all out of it, of him giving me an autograph. And I found that picture while we were building the Hall of Fame. And wow. How I even stumbled across it, I think, is a God thing. And there's another one in there that we can talk about later. But anyway, I looked at it, and the thing that it struck me is he treats me the same today, and when we open the hall, as he did that day, and he treats everybody that way. And that's what I've told our staff, and that's what I said at the groundbreaking, that if the biggest name in the sport can treat everybody the same, that's our North Star. That's what we need to do. So I keep that picture on my desk, and we talk about it a lot and that's the first race I went to.
Yeah.
So I became a lifelong Petty fan because of that, and then, saw him and others, as I grew up. But back to your original question, if Dad went to Rockingham, and called the turns, we would tag along with him. Or if we went to Atlanta, if it was in the summer back then, he would take us. And we'd go to the Braves game on Saturday and the race on Sunday. And, if your dad hunts and fishes, you tend to hunt and fish. Yep. So I grew up around the sport and just always had the bug and wanted to be involved in it. But you couldn't make a living broadcasting back when I graduated from college. So I just got involved, from a part-time standpoint.
That's awesome. So I know you mentioned in that story you got pulled out of school and brought all your homework and stuff. It made me think back to my childhood where I missed a lot of Mondays after Martinsville because it rained so often.
Yeah,
my dad had no problem letting me take off a day and come back to the track with him.
And I honestly, now that you mention that, I don't ever remember a rain delay that Dad stayed over and missed a day of work. He ran the store and he could have. But I don't ever remember having a rain delay. Now that I think about it, I know I struggled if I would have them working for MRN and Duke Power at the same time, while I worked for people that totally understood it at Duke Power and knew that, that was my hobby, and it was no different than somebody taking a Monday off to play golf or, take their kids to play soccer or something like that. But I don't ever remember having a rain delay with Dad, or that would have been an overnight. It could have happened that he drove us home from Martinsville and went back and called the race on Monday. I just don't remember it.
Yeah. So you talked about the Universal Racing Network. Was that like a pre-MRN? Was that similar to that, or? It
is very similar. So a guy out of Winston-Salem, he's passed away, a guy named Hank Schofield. He was very prominent in journalism. In the early days in NASCAR. He had a company called Universal Services that did a lot of printing of everything from church bulletins, but also he had a magazine called Southern Motor Racing. And Hank and Universal Racing Network they probably covered 18, 20 races a year. Dad probably did an average of about 12. They were the network before the Motor Racing Network in the 60s. That's where Ned Jarrett got his start, when he got out of the car and started with URN. And Hank was an interesting guy. He gave me my first opportunity in 1981. I wanted to get my foot in the door, so I called Hank and I said, "Have you got anything that I can do?" I wanted. He knew who I was and that I wanted to be involved. But
how old were you at this time?
I would have been about 22-ish, 23. I'd have been about 23. At that time, I was working full-time at Duke Power at one of the nuclear plants at that time, and thought, okay, now's the time to try to get my foot in the door. And he said, well, I need a statistician for the races, and it pays $50 a race and a motel room. No expenses. So if I went to Richmond or Atlanta, I was losing money.
Right.
But I didn't care.
Yeah,
I didn't care.
There if I were to stay.
If it had paid me nothing, I'd have gone.
Yeah,
but
right.
it paid $50 a race, and if I could carpool, but I got a hotel room, and if it was a Rockingham, I'd just drive down Sunday morning because they weren't doing the Saturday races and whatnot. So URN did a lot of the races, but nobody did all of the races, and it wasn't Hank's full-time job. He was track general manager at North Wilkesboro, which, that helped me advance. That's where I got to do some PA work and actually got to be on the microphone. But it wasn't what Hank did on a full-time basis. And so that's in the 80s. So Dad started with them in like 1965, 64, 65. And URN had been around a while. I don't know their exact origin. But in 1969, leading into the 70 season, is when Bill France Sr. said, we need somebody that'll do all the races. We need a network that'll be kind of like a marketing arm, but to make sure all the races are on the radio. And that's when he asked Ken Squire to start what became Motor Racing Network. And over time, and with no disrespect to Hank, MRN advanced their equipment. They had the remote equipment. When I would go with Dad, if he was on pit road, I'd go get the drivers that fell out of the race and bring them to Dad because it was on hardline. And over time, MRN invested because that's what they were going to do long haul. And this wasn't Hank's primary job. His primary job was Universal Services that had many arms to it, printing and whatnot. And then he was track general manager at North Wilkesboro. So, over time, URN kind of phased out, if you will, and MRN through the 70s, and then became the network. And actually the 81, the first year that I was on with URN, or I was a statistician, we did 11 races. We had 5 tracks. I actually did an IndyCar race and 2 Cup races in Atlanta. We had Martinsville, Richmond, Rockingham, and Darlington, I think, were the ones that we had, and then
all the good ones
phased out. I could afford to drive to them.
Right.
I didn't have to drive across country, but that's kind of how it started.
It sounds like they had a pretty good vision for MRN. Like they kind of knew what they wanted, or would you say that, or?
If you ask anybody, I did not personally know Bill France Sr., but if you ask people that knew him and you ask for how would you describe him, visionary would be what you would hear people talk about, going back to his vision of forming NASCAR in 1947 and how he got those people together at the Streamline Hotel. And it was exactly the same with MRN, knowing that, it wasn't something. I think if Hank had chosen that this is what I want to do and I want to grow it, my gut feeling, I never asked Hank, I never asked Bill Jr. or anybody like that, but I think because it just wasn't something that was going to happen, that Bill Sr. saw, this is something we need to make sure everybody can listen to the races. And it was when, you might have a little snippet of one on an ABC Wide World of Sports back in that time, but radio was the predominant form of getting to people back in the late 60s and early 70s. And he had that vision, and he got dead on the right person in Ken Squire to actually do it. And I think Ken shared that vision with him. So, it's been exactly that, and while TV has evolved so much over the years, I think what MRN has done over the last 50 plus years, and am I biased? Yeah. But when I, when I look at everything that MRN has done and the people that have come through it, behind the scenes and on the microphones, it's done exactly what Bill Sr. Thought it should do, could do, and would do for the sport.
Well, you're talking to 2 guys here that, like we said at the opening of the show, ingrained in our childhood, that it's kind of the soundtrack to Sunday afternoons if we weren't in front of a TV. So I think it was more than successful. It continues to be successful.
Yeah, I didn't have the option of the TV back when I was growing up. I mean, I remember sitting under the tree listening to the first Talladega race because that was in '69 that Dad did with URN, because MRN came into fold in 1970 and started with the what were then ISC tracks, Daytona, Talladega, and then just kind of evolved from there. But radio was the only way that we could keep up with it.
So I know you got to MRN and you started out as kind of like a gopher status. If you don't mind, share the story of who couldn't make it to the track and how you got kind of thrown into your first experience with MRN.
Yeah, I started pestering MRN about 1987, that I wanted to work with them and was, they called it a production assistant. It was a gopher. I'd help, set up equipment, tear down equipment, either be a spotter in the turns or run information. So that's early 87. So, it gave me a chance to do some more PA, but it was the latter part of 1988 that John McMullen, the president, and he was always up front with me. I didn't have a radio background and all that. So he had told me that he was going to give me a shot the end of October at the doubleheader that had the modified race and the bush race. So that's fine. I was just happy to be in the mix. And so in September, in the Cup race weekend, Saturday there was a bush race, but it was not being aired. But they were doing an audition for a couple of guys in the turn. And he said, well, why don't you go on pit road and you can, go through the same motions, do a couple of interviews, and if somebody falls out of the race, talk to them or describe what happens to give you a little bit of practice for, 6-7 weeks down the road. So like, okay, happy to do that. And it was great practice because they'd stop during the middle of the broadcast and give feedback to all of us. Which you can't do in a regular race, and I think Joe Moore and Barney or Joe Moore and Eli were up in the booth, whoever it was, they'd give you feedback. So I'm making notes the next morning to run information. There were 2 pit roads at that time, one on the front straightaway, one on the back. Mike Joy was going to do the front straightaway, and Jim Phillips was going to do the back straightaway. And I'm making notes to be able to, know where everybody's pitting and where I could run information. And it's probably a couple of hours at the most before the race. And John said, do you think you're ready for this? And I said, I'm as ready as I'm ever going to be. And they said, you're going to be on the air. Mike Joy was fogged in Roanoke. Apparently he had some kind of commitment on Saturday and was going to come in on Saturday night and or Sunday morning. And I don't remember the exact flight schedule, but he got fogged in and wasn't able to be there. And it's sometimes you just got to be in the right place at the right time. But having spent well over a year and a half, it's like, and I didn't have time to get nervous.
Right.
So it worked out for me. And Mike was in a place in his career that he was transitioning. He was still doing radio, but he was already doing TV with CBS and things like that. And there was no animosity. It's just I was in the right place at the right time. And there's other people within the last 10 years that if I couldn't stay over for a race because of my full-time job or something like that I'm sure the same things happened for them.
Yeah. I love that story, because I feel like it probably would have happened anyways, but it's just, it's neat how one day something goes wrong and you're the guy for the job and here we are.
Well, I must not have screwed it up too bad, or they invited me back, and then I got to do, a few more in the garage area the rest of that year, and then started doing more in 89 and just kind of went from there.
I've always noticed like an incredible chemistry with the MRN broadcast. My whole life I felt like the chemistry between you guys, you, Barney Hall, Joe Moore, Dave Moody, Jeff Striegel, Alex Hayden, all those guys. I don't know if I've ever seen a chemistry like that in any other sports broadcasting, period.
Yeah.
What do you think made that so special? It sounds like a bunch of just friends hanging out and sharing what they're seeing with the people that are listening.
I think there's a number of reasons. I think number one, if you go back to Barney Hall, Barney is the voice of NASCAR in my opinion, and all due respect to Ken Squire, Ken was the voice and storyteller and on TV. But if you look at just the voice and you close your eyes, to me, Barney Hall is the voice and the radio voice of MRN or of NASCAR in general. And Barney always used to say, if you stick to the race, you can't have a bad broadcast. You got, and it's not about the guy holding a microphone. There's one person that ever tuned in because I was on the radio, and that was my mother. And when my mother passed away, nobody's ever tuned in. And as somebody who's a broadcaster, I've got ones I like. I like Jim Nance, but I'm not going to say, okay, well, I'm going to watch this golf tournament because he's broadcasting. I might mute somebody I don't like.
Yeah.
But you don't tune in because of who's broadcasting. And it's about the people in the field, on the field, in the garage, on the racetrack, in the arena, call it whatever you want to. And that's one of the things that Barney taught us. So I think that's part of it. One of the things that John McMullen did a very good job of is everybody knew their role. And it doesn't mean that you're restricted. It's if you stick to your role, the broadcast is then more seamless. The pit guys have a different role than the guys in the turn. It's not my job if I see a wreck on the front straightaway to jump in and call that wreck. Now, if somebody misses it because it's out of their sight and I can tell them on either the second channel or in a commercial break, I saw how it started. Every now and then they might come down and do that, but that's not my job, and it's not the guy's jobs in the turn to talk about strategy and fuel mileage and all that. And it's, the guys in the booth do both play-by-play. They're the orchestra leader and all that. And then we spend a lot of time in the commercial breaks talking about what's going on in addition to busting on each other. So, but I think the other two things are we like each other. You might not know it if you listen to the commercial channel, but we like each other, and we've got a passion for NASCAR. You add all that stuff together, focusing on the racetrack, doing your job, what your job is, the passion for motorsports, and the fact that we like each other. I think, and there were people that were trying to get their foot in the door when I was, that it was about them. And they didn't stay. And one of the best things that happened to me is spending as long as I did listening to the cue, listening to the behind the scenes and the broadcast. And, if I'd have gotten put on the air real early on, I may have been too stupid to and think it's about me. But listening to it and just watching and learning and seeing guys that made it about themselves versus it's about the team, and everybody had their role. And I think, that's what Barney taught us. And I was told after that first broadcast that Barney said, I'm glad the boy did good because I know how much he wanted to be here. But it was by watching him.
Yeah. It's so funny how he's such an icon in that respect, but he never tried to be. He just, talk about what he saw in front of him.
Barney did not accept that he was an icon. Honest to goodness, Barney didn't think he was a big deal. He, honest to goodness, did not believe that he was that big a deal. Even, and I've always said the King and Junior Johnson are two that they knew they were big deals, but they never acted like it, and they never carry themselves like it. But you can't be the King, you can't be Junior Johnson and not realize that you're a big deal. Barney never accepted that or grasped that concept. I think he appreciated in his later years that we appreciated him as our mentor and his tutelage, but he never really grasped how the fans looked up to him. I think he realized that the competitors that were from Richard and Inman and those guys' days, how much they appreciated him. I don't think the younger folks appreciated him, and part of it is they didn't know him. It wasn't, and Barney wasn't a look at me guy. So if he walked through the garage, everybody didn't know him. The newer people. So that's not a disrespect,
right,
on anybody. But one of the things that happened Barney's last race, and it kind of came about a little bit abruptly as his health was going down, that meant a lot to me, is I went to Richard's bus, and his bus driver went in there and actually woke him up. Now, it's the middle of the afternoon. Y'all know Richard's known for sleeping. And it's like I didn't want to wake him up, and went in there, and he said, "What's going on?" I said, well, Barney has decided that it's time to step away, and I just wonder if you could come by and speak to him. Put on his boots. There he went. And that meant a lot.
Wow.
To Barney. But it's because of who it was.
Yeah. That's incredible. I was going to ask what your favorite Barney Hall story might have been over the years. And you also led me to another question I had, which listening to the broadcasts, the commercial breaks are always my favorite part because y'all used to bust on each other. Was there somebody that you would say was the best at either corny jokes or getting a dig at somebody else during those commercial breaks? Or?
Well, Barney had the best timing. I always said that he had a writer. And what his longtime girlfriend Karen confided in me and actually gave me a folder. If he saw some kind of joke, he might stick it in a folder. But he had unbelievable timing. Some of his stuff was just spontaneous and it just happened. Others, he may have had something in the back of his mind and you really had to listen. And I missed some of them on pit road because it's noisier down there. But he'd come up with some. Jeff Striegel and myself and Alex, we've had some corny ones that are pretty bad over the years. But Barney's were always dead on. Barney's absolute best one, was an all-star race one year, couldn't tell you what year, and Slim Fast was in the sport. Eli had a deal with Slim Fast and did commercials. And the way our commercial breaks would go is you go into the first commercial break is a network commercial that is sold by MRN, and that's one of our commercials. And then you come back and, you might have Richard Petty's leading, Dale Earnhardt second, blah, blah, blah. You give the top five, and we'll be back from the Charlotte Motor Speedway, wherever we were. And then that's the local commercial. So the network commercial was Slim Fast, and Eli was the one actually voicing it, and came out of the commercial break to Barney, and Barney said, "Yep," he said, "you've been on that thing for 2 weeks, and all you've lost is 14 days from the Charlotte Motor Speedway. This is MRN Radio." And it was like a 2 or 3 second delay, and everybody but Eli just busted out laughing. And that's Barney. I will never forget. That is the best. And I'm not one that'll say I'm like Richard. There's not the best NASCAR driver ever. Mm-hmm. Now, as he'll tell you, there's one that's won the most. Right. But there's not the best anything. Is Hank Aaron better than Babe Ruth or vice versa? I don't know. Right. But that's the best commercial joke I can ever remember. And that's classic Barney. So he was the best at that. The rest of us are just kind of being smart alecks with each other.
And all you lost was 14 days.
And that is hilarious.
That was the best one.
Well, I'm so glad we got to share that story. We're going to take a quick break.
Yeah, I was saying, unfortunately, we don't have a really quippy way to go into our sponsor message of Petty's Garage, but
let's hear from him real quick, and we'll be back in just a second. All right, today, the Richard Petty Motorsports Podcast is again presented by Petty's Garage.
Petty's Garage is from the mind of Richard Petty himself. Petty's Garage is a haven for any fan of speed.
That's right. Petty's Garage is a full-service speed shop dedicated to continuing the legacy and reputation of the King.
The experts at Petty's Garage provide exceptional engines, tuning, and high-performance parts for you, the enthusiast.
Famous for the high-quality service and craftsmanship, Petty's Garage embodies Richard Petty's passion for being the best.
The best. Whether you're adding on to a current project, upgrading your ride completely, or just need our tuning department to squeeze out that last little bit of power from your engine, you can trust Petty's Garage to give your car performance that the King would be proud of.
That's right, Petty's Garage has you covered, so visit them online right now at pettys-garage.com. So we were talking during break a little bit about a go-kart you had when you were a kid. I found that story when I was doing my research last night, that you had a go-kart and you were kind of racing around with neighborhood kids, and y'all's was a Petty kart, but it was a little bit different. Yeah, what was the story for that?
Yeah, and I think I want to say it was 69. We were about 10 or 12 years old, my older brother and I, and a lot of folks in the neighborhood got them that year. There's probably 5 or 6 of us, and there was this big field that we could race in. But another guy up the street, a guy named Bobby Utley, who was also a big Petty fan, as were we, he was more proactive, and he painted his Petty blue before we did, and he put a 43 on the back. And so it was leading into 70 when Petty's had the Pete Hamilton car. So we painted ours Petty blue and painted the front bumper red and put a 40 on the back. So it still had a Petty Enterprises go-kart, if you will, but we couldn't copy the neighbor. But because the Hamilton car came out, and I guess if it had been earlier, it may have been we'd have done red for Buddy Baker, but we did one that was Pete Hamilton, and for the longest time I had the frame of that, and then it was in a storage shed that I didn't clear out when I left a place years and years ago. But Petty Blue, red bumper, 40 on what was the air cleaner on the back of the engine.
I was going to ask if you still had the frame and had a chance to look at it any time recently.
Yeah, I did, but I made the mistake of not cleaning out that shed years ago, so I'm sure it is long gone, unfortunately.
Well, at least, you had the Daytona 500 winner on your card at least, that was...
I did, and one of the things, and this is typical Richard, that Richard was the one that helped broker the deal to get the car for Maurice's induction or his Hall of Honor inductee exhibit, because the guy that had bought the car wanted it refurbished, and it was refurbished. There's some debate: is it a Petty car? Is it a Hamilton car? Richie Bars swears it's a Hamilton car, and
right.
Richie Bars is the one that I would go with.
Yep.
And Inman and Richard would feel that way. I'm not sure. I think the owner wanted it to be a Richard Petty car because it's worth more.
Understandably, yeah.
But and Richard was one that helped advance to other people. Maurice was on my nomination list from year one, not because my friendship with the family, but look at the numbers.
Right.
254 wins or something for him. All his wins as a engine builder, and then being a crew chief as well. And Richard wanted to make sure that people realized that Chief was a lot more than the engine builder for Richard Petty. So that was one of my. There are a lot of favorite cars that I've had in here, but that was one of the favorites because of the go-kart tie-in, because of Chief and Mama Trish and just the whole family and everything, and to show that Chief did a little of everything.
Yeah.
A lot of engine building, but a little of everything else.
I'm pretty sure they did the restoration of that car at Petty's garage.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
And we had another car come in there. So I spent a couple years there before my time with the race team, and we had another car come in. It was a really weird deal where the guy that was buying the car, he was from Florida. He found the car online in California, but he said he didn't want to buy it. He didn't want to spend the money if it wasn't a real car, and they thought that it was a Buddy Baker car. But anyways, he convinced the guys from California to bring as a Charger all the way to Level Cross, and they called Richie Bars, and they had Richard Dale and Richie comb over that car for a couple hours one day. And when they said, "Yep, we built this car. It was built here. You got what you said you've got." And the guy said, "All right, here's your check." And he wrote it. And they turned around and went back to California. It was a pretty fun day. But going back to talking about MRN stories, there's a famous story about Ned Jarrett saying that he once made a call from the restroom. Have you ever had a similar incident, maybe not from the restroom, but where you made the call for a stop and maybe where you were on the other end of pit road or had to kind of think on the fly?
Yeah, there are a lot of times that you had to, you wanted to always call what you saw and not speculate. Ned was in the restroom at Martinsville, so he could hear it. And Barney or Mike Joy had forgotten that he had told him in a commercial he was going to go to the restroom, and they said that, I think it was Richard that actually was the one that was pitting, and said Richard had a right front tire go down, and he could hear him change the tire and realize that it was only a 2-tire stop. So he was able to do that, and Ned tells the story. So you wouldn't believe the guy standing beside me in the restroom. So I've not had one in the restroom, but one that was funny. At Rockingham one year, I was on the back straightaway, and this was before they merged the pits, and was interviewing Dave Marcus, who had fallen out of the race. And if somebody butts in because there's a wreck on the track, to turn the microphone off. And there was, somebody butted in and said, trouble in turn 3 and blah, blah, blah. So I turned the microphone off. Well, I couldn't get Dave's attention to let him know we weren't still on the air. A lot of times you'd pull it back, but Dave just kept talking. Well, they finished calling the wreck, went back to the booth, and the booth said, "Let's go back to pit road." I just reopened the microphone. Dave was still talking. So we rejoined the interview in progress. And then when we went to the commercial, they just busted out laughing. They said, "Had he been talking the whole time?" I said, "Yeah." So that's one of the funnier stories. And then I was actually interviewing Earnhardt. If you've heard the water bottle story, when Dale got into Rusty on the early part of the race, about lap 40, 45, something like that at Bristol. Turned him around. Rusty never got back to the front. And Rusty was great at Bristol, and he was mad for 450 laps. Dale finished second, and I'm interviewing him at the gas pumps, which is how they used to do it back then. And Jim had gone to Victory Lane. So I'm interviewing Dale, and all of a sudden we felt something, a little bit of dampness, and something bounced off of, one of our shoulders or something. And Rusty's over, we're standing beside the driver's door, and he's over there trying to get Dale's attention, giving him grief about wrecking him.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was a confrontation. It wasn't physical, but there was a little discussion there that Rusty said, I still hadn't forgotten Talladega. This is in 93 when Dale had hit him and he flipped. And, as Darrell Waltrip calls it, they were frenemies. Yeah. So those were two that I kind of remember as unique interviews.
Did you ever have like go-to crew chiefs that you always knew would give you something good if you needed it?
And it was different at different times. Mm-hmm. Most recently, Todd Gordon has been one of the best. While he'll never say, here's what I'm going to do, but, and one of the things that I learned from Todd, and it's different today than it was when I started in the 80s, that everything's so circumstantial and there's so many different scenarios, and Todd and I would spend time talking about the different scenarios, and he may say, if you see this, you might see that, and mm-hmm. how they run the race backwards at a road course and different scenarios. So Todd has been one that would educate me, and I knew what to look for. And there's times like they short pitted at Richmond, and they short pitted or had a different strategy one of the All-Star races and won both of them. But he didn't say, here's what I'm going to do. He said, you might see in that last stage, you might see somebody short pit and run and stop twice rather than stop once, but it depends on where they're running. Right. If they're running 5th, 6th, 7th, and they need to try to make up some time and take a risk, that's what you might see. But if you're running up front, you're probably not going to give up that track position and take that risk. So if he'd have been running up front, he wouldn't have. And I remember in that scenario, I said they might, we might see somebody short pit, and Rusty came on and said, no, there's no way I'd short pit. And then 2 laps later, here they come. And it was because Todd had said, you might see this, and I didn't say Joey Logano's going to short pit. He was right with Joey. So Todd has been kind of the more recent one. And then, over the years, there were other guys. When I came along, Dale was kind of, easing out, but Robbie Loomis was one that was always very helpful. As much as he was kind of behind the scenes kind of guy, he was always one. Another guy that worked with y'all, Drew Blickensturver, is always one that would be very forthright. Again, they're not going to say, here's what I'm going to do, because I think I know they trusted us. And every now and then somebody would tell you, here's what I'm going to do, but they knew you weren't going to say it until they did it. But so many things are based on the circumstances. So, guys like that, Todd Parrott was always helpful, but didn't want to talk, wouldn't say a lot on the air. Mm-hmm. A lot of them didn't want to say something on the air, but they'd tell you in the garage area, here are some of the things that you to look for throughout the race. So those were some of them. Tim Brewer was another one in the early days that would, share information with you. And then there were a lot of the crew guys that you could go to, whether they were tire guys or other people. Barry Dotson was one that was always very helpful. His brother John was always one that was very helpful. So there were a lot of them. And I think just wearing the MRN mm-hmm. and the fact they knew we weren't going to throw them under the bus, and that we weren't trying to be, I got you, or I got the story first. Mm-hmm. You're trying to learn to articulate what's happening. Because if you speculate, if you said, well, so-and-so said they're going to do this, the circumstances might change. You're going to look like an idiot. Mm-hmm. So you really go to them to get information. You go back to the very first race I did. Ricky Rudd ran really well, and on the back straightaway, and Larry McReynolds was his crew chief. Didn't know me from Adam, but Larry could not have been more helpful that day or any other time that you wanted information. Randy Dorton, if you had an engine question, and now Doug Yates, if you had an engine question. And both of them could take something complex and help the average person. And I'm the average person. I'm not mechanical. So you dumb it down so I can understand it, so I can tell the listener. So Randy and Doug have been two great engine guys that could help us or would help us.
It sounds like you guys had a lot of time to build up some trust, back and forth between the drivers and teams and you guys on the broadcast side.
Well, now a lot of that goes back to Barney Hall, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I became good friends with Junior Johnson, Bud Moore, David Pearson, and those guys because Barney said, you can trust that guy. And I was not going to let Barney Hall down.
Right.
And I think that's what the crew chiefs realized, that we weren't there, I didn't sign up to be Geraldo. I didn't sign up to be anything like that. I wanted to report what was happening. And, Barney also taught us you don't speculate. If you know something's going to happen, somebody's getting ready to pit, or you hear it, when we started having the two-way radios and they said, we're coming in 2 laps. But you say, they said on the radio they are, because if the circumstances can change then.
Right.
So they knew that we were trying to cover the sport and just what happened, what is going to happen. So spent a lot of time in the garage area, and that's the thing I missed the most last year. When I was still on the road, just because of COVID. I get it. I support what NASCAR did.
Yeah,
they did a phenomenal job, but that was the thing that I enjoyed the most, and why I enjoyed pit road more than anything else I did with MRN.
That's great to hear. Switching gears a little bit, I know that you have been on the Kyle Petty charity ride a time or two, and that motorcycles are a big passion point for you. How many years have you done the charity ride?
I think I did about 6, all of them, and then I did part of one in 2008. I did all of one in 2018. So all of, I think, from like 98 to 2004-ish.
Gotcha.
And that's one, I always wanted a motorcycle in spite of my mom not wanting me to have one. But when I bought my first one of the objectives was, in addition to riding to a few races like the Rockinghams and Martinsville, I wanted to go on the charity ride. I wanted to be a part of that. And it's just a wonderful family. With it being in May, it's harder to do the whole thing now in my schedule. But I still have some great friends. Try to go to the reunion every year, and it's just what it has grown to. And I'm like, Kyle, if you'd have told me back in 1980, 1998, 1999, it'd still be going strong. And that's to Kyle's credit, Morgan's credit, and everybody else. But I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I heard a story that you guys, so you were with Richard and Jim France, among others, I think, going from Phoenix to meet up with the ride, and almost got him into a spot where he may have ran out of gas.
You were leading the way, right?
Yeah, how I became the leader is also questionable. I think we were leaving Sonoma, and Richard had some appearances. Jim was going to leave. It started out with Lance Brown and I talking of what our Sunday looked like, and I was doing this morning in NASCAR TV broadcast. So I wasn't on the air. It was a PRN broadcast, but I was doing that and was trying to figure out how I was going to either ship my bike there and, was I going to try to fly with the drivers that were coming in later or whatever. And Lance and I got to talking and said, well, the King's got some appearances. He and I've talked about riding and catching up with them. And I said, man, that's great. So, ended up, I think I put my bike on their trailer rather than with the rest of the charity ride. So it was at the racetrack. And then somewhere along the way, I guess Richard and Jim got to talking about it. So it was the 4 of us. It was Jim and Richard and Lance and myself. And it's like, wow, is this not something else? So we left, mid-morning. And so we go a little different route, thinking we're going to catch up with the ride. And, we weren't, going like bats out of hell, because that's just not how we rode. And the King and Jim didn't ride that way. But we cut some corners So when we went through Fallon, Nevada, never forget that city. We were going from Fallon, Nevada to Austin, Nevada on Highway 50, which is called the world's loneliest highway, which I learned later. And there's a reason for that. And it's 110 miles apart, give or take. So, we get about 10 or 15 miles out of Fallon, and I realize there's nothing around here. Now, how I ended up front, I don't know. I think, it was logical that Lance or I were going to, watch the map and stuff like that.
Right.
But how I ended up front is just either dumb luck, good or bad, however you want to look at it. So we're about, 10, 15 miles out, and it's like, started doing the math in my head, and I think Richard and Lance were on Victories. I think that's who was with the ride back then. Jim was on like a BMW or something like that. He could have gone, to Utah. He would not have had any problem. And I'm on my Harley. I'd have been close. And I think it was the Victories that had either a little bit smaller tank. And I'm doing the math, and I thought, this isn't good. We're gonna, I run Jim France and Richard Petty out of fuel. I will not be back in a NASCAR garage ever. So, but I had a CB. So this truck passed, and I asked him, said, is there any gas stations between here and Austin? He said, yeah, about 30 miles down the road, there's this little small little bar that has gas. So, I'm looking at the speedometer. So if we got to 32 miles, I'm pulling over and I'm saying, okay, guys, I'm sorry, we're going to turn around and go back. I'd rather be embarrassed that way than embarrassed out of gas.
Right.
Sure enough, 26 miles. I'm some things you remember. Yeah. 26 miles, we come up on this crossroad, and there's this little building off to the right. And we pull in there, and there's about a 250-gallon above ground 250-gallon tank. It wasn't high test, which we all ran, but, we put a couple of gallons in because it was going to get us to Austin. So we go in, and I'm getting water and paying for the gas, and Lance is over there also getting water. And while I'm paying for the gas, he tells, I didn't see all this stuff happening, but he said, as Richard walked by, and nobody had anything racing related. I've got the picture, and I meant to bring it in today, of the four of us afterwards. He had a Victory motorcycle jacket on, and he didn't have cowboy hat. I don't even know if he'd put on his ball cap. And he said, there are two guys playing pool.
Yeah.
And one of them looked at the other one, and he says, I'll be a son of a... That was Richard Petty. And Lance said, the other one looked up and said, have you lost your mind? Do you know where we are? And he said, the lady sitting there, girl sitting there with him, looked up and said, well, it did kind of look like him. And he said they got to arguing about it, and they finally looked over at Lance and didn't say anything, just looked at him, kind of, put their hands up, and he said, that's the king. And then I told you that was him. So Richard didn't see all this, and he comes out of the restroom, so then they want pictures with, they want to get his autograph and all that. And we go outside, and there's a few more that come up.
Where'd they come from?
We don't know. There's a few, and Richard even remembered when we talked about it later in the week. He said, yeah, you remember the one that had the dog? There's this big old dog that was with him. And when we went back, Lance and I went back the next year, because we kept talking about it, and we didn't take any pictures. We forgot to take pictures. And Lance sent me some recently, and I have got a few somewhere in there. The next year's ride, that was about 2 hours out of our way, but he and I were bound and determined we were going to go by there. Richard flew. He wasn't going to do this mess, and Jim wasn't a part of it. We never caught up with the ride until we got to the motel that night. It's just we were so far behind them. But to ride with the three of them is absolutely one of my top 5 memories of the charity ride, or just being around. But Lance and I went back there just to take pictures. Oh, wow. And it said Middlegate, Nevada, population 18, and it was painted over and said 17. And we asked them what happened. They said neighbor died.
Oh,
I mean, and we took.
It's not funny, but it's interesting.
We took panoramic pictures, and this is 2002, 2003, and there's nothing out there. It's near where they used to test the original nuclear warheads. We found out later, and it was just this little bar that had like a 12-room hotel, because we paid attention the second time. And Lance even sent me a picture of me, putting a dollar bill. They had everybody sign a dollar bill, and they tacked it to the wall. Lance took pictures that Richard or postcards that Richard had signed back to him, because we didn't have anything the first time, but it's literally in the middle of nowhere, and I'm 100% sure that somebody would have run out of gas. It wouldn't. I would have been close. Jim would have been fine, but Richard or Lance might have run out of gas, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking today, because
Right.
I would have been run out of NASCAR a long time ago. But that picture is one of my most cherished things, that somebody was smart enough to have, the four of us take a picture when we got to the hotel that night.
That's awesome. And it also kind of proves that even out in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, population 17, Richard Petty can still draw a crowd.
Well, and when his humility, but when we're talking about it later in the week, he left for a couple of days to do an appearance and came back for the rest of the ride that year, and we were talking about it, and he said, they just know who we are because of TV. I said, Richard, you hadn't been in the car in how many years? You didn't have on a cowboy hat. You didn't have on glasses. How many guys from that garage would they have recognized? And he just shrugs his shoulders.
Yeah.
It's different. Richard is Richard. They may have Dale had been passed by then, but there's not three people in the garage, especially somebody who hadn't been in a car for at least 10 years at that point, with nothing racing related on.
Yeah. And you're also somebody, I don't know if we had a chance to talk with anybody yet who really knew Miss Linda, too. How would you describe her in a few words?
Oh, God. If there is anybody that's the matriarch of anything, and she's more than the matriarch of just the Petty family. You've got Miss Elizabeth, of course, who was the original matriarch. But if you look at everything that Miss Linda touched, and the thing that amazed a lot of people, because I had been around them a lot, when she passed, and I remember I was sitting on an airplane and was, wired in when I got the word that she had passed, and but in putting together, and we don't do a lot of statements for folks that pass that aren't inductees, but Linda's different. Linda's different because you think about the impact that she's had on NASCAR motorsports. The Petty family is one thing, and driving the station wagon, Mrs. the King station wagon that's in the museum. I think that is so cool.
Yeah,
that is one of my favorite things in there. And that Richard and John Lasseter wanted her to be a part of the movie, because I remember that picture that I'm talking about of Richard handing me an autograph. I remember going by those station wagons when they had the fried chicken there. But to be on school board for 16 years, and to serve as chair, and to be a founding member, the founding chairperson of the Winston Cup Racing Rivals Auxiliary, which is what birthed the Kyle Petty Charity Ride. It was under that umbrella, and all the charity work that she did. And as Richard will tell you, to raise 4 kids, with maybe a little bit of help from the King, but he'll tell you that she was superhuman.
Wow. Yeah.
As what she did, and just one of the kindest, most gentle, most loving people, and always had a smile, always had a hug, always had a good word for somebody. But when I think about all that she did and contributed in her community, to NASCAR, and you look at, and granted I'm biased, but you look at the 4 kids she raised, they're quality.
Yeah.
They really, really are. So she's special here.
Right.
But she's special to a lot of people.
Yeah. She left quite an impact, and I really wish I would have had the chance to get to meet her and spend some time with her. But unfortunately, we came along a little bit after that. Definitely want to give you a chance to talk about, the Hall of Fame, kind of everything you guys have going on right now. here we are, what's today? Beginning of March 2021. I know you guys are open, so talk a little bit about kind of current state of things here at the Hall of Fame.
Well, everything right now in 2021 is, you qualify it with all things considered. All things considered, we're doing very well. Health-wise, everybody's healthy. We've been open since the middle of September. We were ready a little bit a lot earlier than that to be open. We've got, and I won't bore you with all the safety protocols that we put into place.
Yeah.
Well, we can tell from getting in here that they're there. They are there.
Well, and that we have a mask mandate that people have been very respectful of, and people understand what we're doing, and they're patient when it takes them a little bit longer to wait to get in the simulator because you need to clean things. From a business standpoint, we're not doing events like we used to, but from a general admission standpoint, we're at about 52% of what we were the same time last year, and what we've heard from other industry consultants and museums, most of them are in the 25% range. So when you look at all things considered, we're that bucket list thing.
Yeah.
People are still coming and people average 564 miles to come here.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Average 564 miles. 85% come from more than 50 miles. Over 60% come from more than 200 miles. They stay overnight. It's that bucket list thing. So we're still that. It's just the volume is down just like everything else. And we've had, great classes every year. We are planning for the class of 2021, which will go in late. We change out exhibits on a regular basis. We've just changed out our what we call our Great Hall. So we've got 10 cars representing all the first 10 classes. We didn't get to do a 10-year anniversary. So we've got a car from each one of those first 10 classes that was actually here as a part of their induction, as well as information about all 10 classes just changed out. In our Victory Lane area, we'd had Dale Jr.'s last car. We just got Jimmy Johnson's last car from Phoenix, and 20 of his uniforms and a bunch of his trophies. And we just did what we call our memorable moments, which highlights some memorable things from the year before, one of which is the King's face mask or face covering from when he went to Talladega, because that was such a big deal race of what happened down there with Bubba and Richard going and said, I want to be with my driver.
Right.
So we tell memorable moments off on the track, but as well as off the track. New Champions case, have done a lot of upgrades back in the end of 2019 to all of our interactives. And then we installed a new Glory Road that Dale Jr. helped us pick all the cars. He picked the theme, which were champions, Cup Series champions, and then the cars. And we were able to get the first and seventh of the 3 7-time champions. We've never had 2 of any one driver on there. So we've got 2 Earnhardt, 2 the King, and 2 Jimmy. But it's not just any 2, it's the first and seventh of each of theirs.
That's crazy.
And then just an evolution of different ones that Dale was intrigued with. And there were older ones, other than Jimmy and Jeff's and Tony Stewart's. All the rest of them, are 90s back to the 50s, just because he likes the history of the sport so much. So a lot of stuff going on. We look forward to the next class, and it's just been a blessing to be here and to work with people like the King. I've got more King stories about his support here. The very first car that we ever unveiled was his. And do we have time?
I reset the cameras. We can go for another 30.
Going? Okay. I know we've already kept you a long time.
Yeah, that's okay. I remember, God, what year? This would have been about 2007. We were just starting building a hall, and I'd seen Inman at Richmond, and he said, King wants to ask you something. So, missed him that weekend. So it was a weekend or two later, went and saw him at Dover in the hauler. And he was there were a couple of other kind of museum related type things. And I said, well, I got you. I said, I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask Richard Childress the same thing. If you had one car that you want to be on this exhibit we're going to do with 17 other cars, what would it be? And so Richard, as you guys probably know, goes to a lot of museums. He and Miss Linda and Dale and Mary would go to museums when they traveled. So he was more interested in the museum. And so told him that what we were looking at. And I said, and keep in mind, we might need 2. Why are you going to need 2? How much you going to pay me for those? And I said, well, we'll probably need 2 because I've got to assume you're going in the first class of the Hall of Fame. And he said, well, how are y'all going to decide that? And I said, well, I really don't know because that's something NASCAR's working on because they're responsible for that. And, we're still 3 years from opening, but, we know about this one exhibit. And we got to have a Richard Petty car and we'll need an Earnhardt car. And, I can't go ask everybody what they want on there, but do you have a favorite? So he, again, became more interested in the museum part of it. So I said, well, this was an excuse to go up there. So I said, well, I'll bring you some renderings up there and show you what we're doing. So I took him through all the renderings. And he was very interested and said in one area, have you thought about including this person as a part of that? And most of them we had thought about, but, he mentioned one guy. I said, nah, we need to get them on there. So it was really not just fun, but it was very informative. And Richard was one of the first people we took our exhibit designers to meet with to learn about the history of the sport. So after I got through showing him all that, and then I showed him what Glory Road is, which is 18 cars that have different themes that were going to be changed out every 2 or 3 years. And I said, here's the Hall of Honor where where another car would be. Because in that first conversation, he said, I think y'all to put them in, chronologically. You got to start with guys like Raymond Parks and my dad and people like that. And I said, so you're not going to put in the most successful, the most popular, the most recognizable guy. He said, that's just how I think. And he said that the night before the first vote.
Oh, wow.
I saw him at one of the Petty events up in Greensboro. And he really felt like it ought to be chronological in how we did it. And I said, they ain't going to burn your house down if you don't go in. They ain't going to burn my house down.
Yeah.
So I just got to plan that way. So after I finished explaining all that, he just looked at me and he said, the cars we have. This is before it was moved out of Randleman. He said, the cars that we have. You just need to tell me what you want, and we'll tell Freddie, and that's what you'll have. And I was
take your pick.
Blown away.
Wow.
But when you think about Richard, it's about what's good for the sport. Yeah. Why he is always going to be aware of what's good for Richard Petty Motorsports, Petty Enterprises back in the day, or now the Petty Museum. So what do you want? And I thought I knew, but it's like I didn't expect that. So I said, let me get back to you. Yeah. I said, let me get back to you. So a few weeks later, we were going to be in Bristol, and I'd talked to Lance or Brian or somebody and, just said, is there a time that I can just go by the bus and talk to him? And they gave me a time, and I went in there and I said, well, here's what I want to do. And if something changes, but what I'd like to have, I said, I'd like the 67. Most successful car. Yep. I said, I'm partial to the all blue. And, I know, you are too, with all due respect to STP, but it's going to be there for probably 3 years. The most successful, the winningest car in NASCAR history. What you did, it's all blue. And then when you get in, assuming whether it's first or second year, then let's do an STP car up there. And, you tell me which one's best. I said, I think, probably one of the Dodges, that 74, 75-ish. Yeah. And he said, okay. Then we spent the next 55 minutes talking about the elections because it's 2008. And it was, he's into that. I mean, it wasn't even a 5-minute conversation, but he says, you tell me what you want. And, that's one of the things I love about what I do and why I tell the people that work here that it's not about us. And when the most successful person and family in the history of sport do this, that's how we need to treat people.
Right.
And he's that North Star. And so that's one of my favorite Richard stories. And I think the only reason he wasn't unanimous in the first class is he didn't help himself. He was lobbying for his dad. So I think some people listened to it.
Yeah, right. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. That's some great insight. I know we've taken up way more of your time than we said we would, and
broke a camera in the process.
But I can't thank you enough for spending time with us and sharing these stories.
Much.
Well, when you're talking about the subject, I like a lot, and just there's so many other stories of that. What Richard, I see Maurice's sticker on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
Chief was very special, as was Mama Trish, and seeing Mama Trish fight her cancer for one goal. She was going to be here when Chief got in,
mm-hmm.
and that was important.
Yeah.
So I'm not a lot of little boys grow up to even meet their childhood heroes, much less be able to call them friends. And when people like Richard and Chief and Inman, and I've got other Inman stories, when your childhood heroes are people you can call personal friends, you have been blessed.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to probably write down everything we didn't get to cover today and call you again here in a few months and come use the Hall of Fame conference room again, because there's a lot on my list we didn't get to.
Yeah, and if you ever want to come up to the garage, we can set up in our conference room. I need to get back.
I want to get back up there. I need to get back up there. I love going up there and just walking through and seeing stuff. And you always, even here, but there, you always see stuff. It's like either I remember that or grew up around that, or I didn't know that. Or when I look at Miss Linda's doll collection, I look at Richard's collection of guns and things like that. It's just something that's so cool. And you see the different cars and the work that Petty's Garage is doing. Well, if I got one of those cars, I would be in trouble.
Well, man. We know
I did get to drive one time. I went out with one of the guys. I think it was when Stedman was there, and one that they had done, a Challenger, and I love that Challenger body.
Well, we just got to be careful with you that you don't run out of gas with it.
That's a risk.
Yeah, thanks again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We'll have to have you on again, and this has been great. It's been absolutely awesome.
Been my pleasure. Appreciate what y'all do.
And how about that?
That was an awesome episode.
Yeah.
I can't thank Winston again enough for sharing his insight into the sport and his stories from 30 plus career as a broadcaster. It was amazing to sit down with him and talk through all that stuff, and hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find this podcast. Also, you can listen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We appreciate you guys giving us a like, leaving reviews, sending us your feedback, letting us know what you think.
Share it with your friends.
Please share it with your friends. Tell everybody you know about it. We need it. So appreciate your support. Remember, if you have a question for us on the podcast, you can tweet us using hashtag AskRPM. We're hoping to get to those in future episodes with an extra segment. So thanks for your engagement and your participation and your support. See you next time.